When Margaret Hayes placed her simple wrapped gift under the Christmas tree that year, she heard the snickers. She saw the eye rolls. Her grandchildren had brought designer gadgets, expensive jewelry, luxury gifts wrapped in gold foil and silk ribbons. And there sat her present, wrapped in plain brown paper tied with ordinary twine, with a small, white envelope attached. They laughed at it. They mocked it. But when they finally opened that envelope and read what she had written inside, the entire room fell silent. Grown men wept. Daughters collapsed into their mother's arms. And nothing in that family was ever the same again. It started 6 months before Christmas, on a humid June morning, when Margaret sat in Dr. Patterson's office, her weathered hands folded in her lap. The doctor's words came at her like stones thrown through glass. "Stage 4, he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Margaret. We can make you comfortable, but there's no treatment that would be effective at this point." Margaret was 78 years old. She had buried a husband, raised 4 children on a waitress's salary, and survived more heartbreak than most people could imagine. But this news hit differently. This was final. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "6 months, maybe 8 if you're fortunate." "I'm truly sorry." She drove home in her ancient Buick, the one with the crack in the windshield she could never afford to fix, and sat in her small living room for a long time. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock her late husband Robert had hung 40 years ago. It still kept perfect time. Margaret thought about her children. Patricia, her eldest, who had married a successful attorney and now lived in a mansion in Connecticut. Daniel, her only son, a real estate developer in California who drove a Tesla and wore watches that cost more than Margaret's entire yearly income. Jennifer, her middle daughter, a corporate executive who traveled the world and stayed in 5-star hotels. And Amy, the youngest, a surgeon married to another surgeon, with a house so large Margaret got lost in it the one time she visited. They were all successful, all wealthy, all busy. They loved her, she knew that. But somewhere along the way, as they climbed their ladders and built their empires, they had forgotten where they came from. They had forgotten what really mattered. Margaret made a decision that day. She would not tell them about the diagnosis. Not yet. Instead, she would give them something far more valuable than the news of her impending death. She would give them the truth. She spent the next 6 months writing. Every morning, she would wake at 5, make herself a cup of black coffee, the only luxury she allowed herself, and sit at her small kitchen table with a pen and lined paper. Her arthritis made it difficult, her hand cramping after just a few paragraphs, but she persisted. She wrote about Robert, their father, the man they barely remembered. She wrote about the year he lost his job at the factory and how they survived on government cheese and food pantry donations, but he never once complained. She wrote about the night Patricia had pneumonia at age 7 and they couldn't afford the hospital, so Robert held her upright all night long so she could breathe, hour after hour, until the fever broke at dawn. She wrote about Daniel's first bicycle, the one Robert found at a garage sale for $3, then spent weeks sanding down and repainting until it looked almost new. About how Daniel's face had lit up on Christmas morning when he saw it under the tree, and how Robert had smiled through his exhaustion, having stayed up all night to finish it. She wrote about Jennifer's college fund, the one that never existed because there was no extra money to save. About how Margaret worked double shifts at the diner for 2 years straight, her feet bleeding into her shoes, so Jennifer could go to community college. About the tips she hid in a coffee can, counting them over and over, hoping it would be enough. She wrote about Amy's wedding, the one Margaret paid for by selling her engagement ring, the only piece of jewelry she had ever owned. She never told Amy. She let her daughter believe Robert's life insurance had been more than it was, let her have the dream wedding she wanted without the burden of guilt. Margaret wrote about the Christmases when she wrapped empty boxes and put them under the tree just so it would look full, promising the real presents would come later, knowing they never would. She wrote about the times she went without eating so her children could have seconds. About the winters she kept the heat turned down to save money, wearing 3 sweaters to bed. She wrote about the sacrifices that were invisible, the 1,000 small deaths of dignity and comfort she endured so her children could have more. about the job opportunities she turned down because they would have meant less time at home, about the classes she never took, the dreams she never chased because being their mother was the only dream that mattered. But most of all, she wrote about love, about how none of it had been a burden, how she would do it all again without hesitation, how watching them succeed had been the greatest joy of her life, even if they no longer understood the cost of that success. The words filled page after page, her handwriting growing shakier as the months passed and the cancer ate away at her strength. By October, she was writing only a few sentences a day. By November, she was struggling to hold the pen. Christmas was planned for December 23rd at Patricia's house in Connecticut. Margaret told her children she would drive up, refusing their offers to send a car service. She needed her independence, she said, needed to do this herself. What she didn't tell them was that every mile of that drive hurt, that she had to stop 3 times to rest, that she nearly turned around twice because the pain was so intense. When she arrived at Patricia's mansion, she was struck, as always, by the opulence. The house was something out of a magazine, with soaring ceilings and marble floors and a Christmas tree that must have been 20 feet tall, decorated by professionals in a theme of silver and gold. There were hired caterers in the kitchen, preparing a feast that would cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a year. Her children greeted her warmly, but she could see it in their eyes. They were busy. They had places to be, people to impress. Christmas was just another obligation to check off their lists, another photo opportunity for their social media feeds. Her grandchildren were polite, but distant. Tyler, Patricia's son, was a Harvard senior who spent the entire evening on his phone. Olivia, Daniel's daughter, arrived late in a chauffeur-driven car, wearing a coat Margaret knew cost several $1,000s. The others were similar, caught up in their devices and their own importance, treating the gathering as an inconvenience rather than a celebration. The gift exchange happened after dinner. Patricia went first, distributing beautifully wrapped boxes to everyone. For Margaret, she had chosen an expensive cashmere sweater, still with the designer tag attached. $600. Margaret smiled and thanked her, knowing she would never wear it, knowing it would hang in her closet until she died. Daniel presented his gifts next, high-end gadgets and electronics that came in sleek black boxes. For Margaret, a new tablet because she should really get with the times, he said. She didn't have the heart to tell him she wouldn't know how to turn it on. Jennifer gave gift cards, generous ones, to restaurants and stores Margaret would never visit. Amy gave a spa package, a day of luxury treatments at some exclusive resort. Again, Margaret smiled and expressed gratitude, even though her heart was breaking at how thoroughly her children had missed the point. Then came the grandchildren's gifts, each more extravagant than the last. Designer handbags, jewelry, expensive wines, the latest tech toys. The pile of discarded wrapping paper grew into a small mountain, gold and silver foil glittering under the chandelier light. Finally, it was Margaret's turn. She retrieved her gifts from her old canvas bag, the same one she had carried to the grocery store for 30 years. Each present was identical, wrapped in plain brown paper tied with twine, with a small white envelope attached. The moment she began handing them out, she heard it. The barely suppressed laughter. Tyler smirked at Olivia. Jennifer exchanged a glance with Amy. Even Patricia, usually the most tactful, couldn't hide her slight grimace. "Oh, how rustic," Jennifer said, trying to sound kind but failing. "Very handmade," Daniel added, and there was no mistaking the condescension in his tone. The grandchildren were less subtle. "Did Grandma wrap these with newspaper?" One of them whispered, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Others giggled. Margaret said nothing. She simply finished distributing the gifts and returned to her chair, her body aching, her heart heavy but resolved. "Well, should we open them?" Patricia asked, clearly ready to move on to more impressive presents. "Please," Margaret said quietly. They tore into the brown paper without ceremony, expecting perhaps homemade cookies or knitted scarves, the kind of simple gifts an old woman on a fixed income might give. Instead, they found books. Plain, spiral-bound notebooks, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $1.99. The covers were blank except for each person's name written in Margaret's shaky handwriting. The disappointment was palpable. Tyler actually rolled his eyes. Olivia set hers aside, without even opening it. Daniel flipped through a few pages with obvious disinterest. "They're blank," Jennifer said, confused. "They're not blank," Margaret replied. "Read the first page." Patricia opened hers first, more out of obligation than curiosity. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, then stopped. She went back to the beginning and read more slowly. Her expression changed. The polite smile faded, replaced by something deeper, more troubled. "Mom," she whispered, "what is this?" "It's the truth," Margaret said. "Keep reading." One by one, they began to read. The room, which moments before had been filled with chatter and laughter, fell silent except for the rustle of turning pages. Margaret had personalized each notebook. Patricia's began with the story of her birth, how Margaret had labored for 22 hours in a county hospital because they couldn't afford anything better, how she had held her firstborn daughter and promised her the world, even though she had nothing to give but love. It told of the year Patricia wanted to be in the school play, but they couldn't afford the costume. So Margaret stayed up for 3 nights straight, sewing one by hand from fabric remnants she found at a thrift store. It told of the time Patricia was bullied at school for wearing secondhand clothes and how Margaret had cried alone in the bathroom afterward, feeling like a failure as a mother. The notebook went on, year by year, documenting every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of love that Patricia had been too young to remember or too busy to acknowledge as an adult. The time Margaret sold her only winter coat so Patricia could have a proper one for her college interviews. The graduation gift that Margaret had saved for by donating plasma twice a week for 6 months, making herself weak and dizzy, but knowing Patricia needed a laptop for school. Daniel's notebook told similar stories. The baseball glove Margaret bought by working an extra job cleaning offices at night. The father-son camping trip Daniel had wanted to go on, but Robert couldn't afford to take him. So Margaret secretly saved for months and surprised them with the money, pretending it was from a small bonus Robert never actually received. Jennifer's notebook detailed the years of Margaret's invisible labor. The school lunches packed with love and whatever food they had. The report cards Margaret celebrated with such joy, even when she didn't understand the advanced subjects Jennifer was studying. The college application fees Margaret paid by selling her own mother's wedding ring, a family heirloom she had hoped to pass down but sacrificed so Jennifer could have a future. Amy's notebook began with the story of her difficult birth, how she had been born premature and spent 6 weeks in the NICU, and how Margaret had walked 4 miles each way to the hospital every single day to be with her because they couldn't afford the parking fees. It told of the violin lessons Amy had wanted, and how Margaret worked as a cleaner at the music school in exchange for discounted lessons, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors while other mothers simply wrote checks. Each notebook ended the same way, with a letter dated just weeks before Christmas. Margaret's handwriting was almost illegible by then, the words wandering across the page, but the message was clear. The letter said that she had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago, that she had perhaps weeks left, maybe days, that she had chosen not to tell them because she wanted to give them something more important than pity or guilt. She wanted to give them perspective. She wrote that she didn't want their money or their things. She had never wanted that. What she wanted was for them to understand what she had given them, not to make them feel guilty, but to help them understand what really mattered in life. She wanted them to know that love isn't measured in dollars or square footage or designer labels. Love is measured in sacrifice, in time, in presence, in the 1,000 invisible ways we give ourselves to others. She wanted them to remember that before they were successful, before they were wealthy, before they had all the things they now took for granted, they were loved. Deeply, completely, sacrificially loved by 2 people who had nothing but gave everything. And she wanted them to pass that lesson on to their own children, who were growing up in a world of abundance, but seemed to be starving for something real. The letter ended with a simple statement: "I don't have long left, but I gotta spend my life watching you grow into remarkable people. That was the greatest gift I ever received. Please don't let my sacrifice be for nothing. Remember what really matters. Remember where you came from. Remember to love." The silence in the room was absolute. Patricia's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the notebook. Tears streamed down her face, dropping onto the pages, smearing the ink of Margaret's words. Daniel had his head in his hands, his shoulders heaving with sobs. Jennifer had gone pale, staring at the notebook as if it were something alive and dangerous. Amy was on her knees on the floor, the notebook clutched to her chest, making a sound like a wounded animal. The grandchildren, who had been so dismissive moments before, were reading over their parents' shoulders, their faces stricken with understanding that came too late. Tyler was crying openly, this Harvard senior who thought he was too sophisticated for family sentiment. Olivia had removed her expensive coat and let it fall to the floor, forgotten, her attention entirely on the words her grandmother had written. "Mom," Patricia finally managed to say, her voice broken. "Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret sat in her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years, the cancer visible now in the hollowness of her cheeks, the way her clothes hung on her shrinking frame. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked gently. "Would you have heard me 6 months ago? Or would you have just thrown money at the problem and gone back to your busy lives?" The truth of her words landed like a hammer. They all knew the answer. "I wanted to give you something you couldn't buy," Margaret continued, her voice growing weaker. "I wanted to give you the truth before it was too late. Not to hurt you, my darlings, never to hurt you, but to wake you up. To remind you that life is short and things are just things, but love, real love, the kind that sacrifices and serves and shows up even when it's hard, that's what endures. That's what matters." Daniel crossed the room and knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her frail hands in his. "I'm so sorry," he whispered.
"I'm so sorry, Mom."
"I forgot. God help me. I forgot everything." "I know, baby," Margaret said, stroking his hair the way she had when he was a little boy with a skin knee. "But you remember now. That's what matters." One by one, they came to her. Her children, her grandchildren, all of them gathering around this old woman in her thrift store dress, this woman who had given them everything and asked for nothing. They cried together, really cried, perhaps for the first time in decades. The kind of crying that comes from deep wounds finally being opened, from truth finally being spoken, from love finally being understood. Patricia held her mother and apologized for the years of distance, for the phone calls rushed through between meetings, for the holidays treated as obligations rather than gifts. Daniel confessed that he had been ashamed of his mother's poverty, ashamed of how she looked next to his wealthy friends, and the confession broke him. Jennifer admitted she had avoided visiting because it made her uncomfortable to see how little her mother had, never understanding that it was because she had given it all away. Amy sobbed against Margaret's shoulder, remembering all the times she had been too busy to visit, all the calls she had let go to voicemail, all the moments she had chosen her career over her mother. The grandchildren, confronted perhaps for the first time with the reality of sacrifice and genuine love, were shaken to their cores. They read the notebooks, passing them around, learning about a grandfather most of them barely remembered, about a grandmother they had taken for granted, about a kind of love that seemed almost incomprehensible in their world of easy abundance. As the night wore on, the mansion's professional decorations and catered food and expensive gifts faded into insignificance. The family gathered in the living room, sitting on the floor around Margaret's chair, and they talked. Really talked the way families are supposed to, but so often don't. Margaret told them stories they had never heard. About Robert's last day, how he had made her promise not to let their children forget where they came from. About the pride she felt watching them succeed, even as it took them further from her. About the nights she lay awake worried that in giving them more than she had somehow failed to give them what mattered most. "You didn't fail, Grandma," Tyler said, and it was the first time he had looked up from his phone in anyone's memory. "We did. We failed you." "No," Margaret said firmly, with more strength than she had shown all evening. "You didn't fail me. You forgot, that's all. People forget. We get caught up in the race, in the climbing, in the accumulation. We forget that none of it means anything if we lose sight of love. But you remember now, and that means everything. She looked around at her family, at these beautiful, successful, heartbroken people who had come from nothing and built so much, and she smiled.
I'm proud of you, she said.
I need you to know that. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. I just needed you to remember the cost. Not so you would feel guilty, but so you would understand the value of what you have. So you would know what to hold on to and what to let go of. Don't leave us, Amy begged, her face pressed against her mother's knee.
Please, Mom.
We just figured it out. We just understood.
Don't go yet.
I don't have that choice, sweetheart, Margaret said gently. But this is why I wrote the notebooks. So you wouldn't forget again. So when life gets hard and busy and confusing, you can read them and remember what matters. You can remember that you are loved, have always been loved, and that love is the only thing you really need to pass on. Patricia wiped her eyes and asked the question they were all thinking. How long?
Dr.
Patterson said weeks, maybe less. The cancer is in my bones now, my liver. There's nothing more to be done except manage the pain. Margaret said it matter-of-factly, having made her peace months ago. You'll stay here, Patricia said immediately. We'll take care of you. Hire nurses, whatever you need. No, Margaret shook her head. I want to go home. To my house, to my bed, where Robert and I slept for 40 years. That's where I want to be. Then we'll come to you, Daniel said. All of us. We'll take shifts. You won't be alone. And they did. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret's small house that had stood empty so many nights, visited so infrequently by her busy children, was filled with family. They came and they stayed. They took time off from their important jobs and canceled their important meetings and postponed their important plans. Patricia set up in the guest room, working remotely when she had to work at all, spending her days sitting with her mother, listening to more stories, filling in the gaps of a childhood she had remembered incorrectly. She learned that her father hadn't died of a quick heart attack as she had always been told, but had suffered for weeks with chest pains he ignored because they couldn't afford the doctor visits, working until the day his heart finally gave out at the factory. Patricia cried for the father she had barely known and the mother who had borne that grief alone. Daniel cooked, discovering a love for it he never knew he had. He made simple meals, the kind his mother had made for him growing up, and they tasted better than anything from the expensive restaurants he usually frequented. He fed his mother soup with a spoon when she became too weak to feed herself, and he understood for the first time what it meant to serve someone you love. Jennifer quit her job. Just quit. Walked away from the 6-figure salary and the corner office and the prestige, because she finally understood that none of it mattered compared to this. She spent her days reading to her mother from books they both loved, and talking about things that had nothing to do with business or success or money. Amy, the surgeon, became her mother's medical advocate, making sure she was comfortable, managing her pain medications, using all her medical knowledge for the one patient who truly mattered. She held her mother's hand through the bad nights and sang to her the lullabies Margaret had once sung to her. The grandchildren came too. Tyler put his phone away and sat with his grandmother, listening to her stories about his grandfather, learning about sacrifice and love from someone who had lived it. Olivia arrived one day with her expensive clothes left behind, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, ready to help however she could. The others followed, bringing food, bringing flowers from their own gardens, bringing their presents, which was all Margaret had ever really wanted. They found the letters Margaret had written them, one for each family member, to be read after she was gone. She had written them during those long months of diagnosis, pouring out her love and her wisdom and her hopes for each of them. Patricia found hers tucked into a cookbook, the one Margaret had used for 40 years, its pages stained and worn. Daniel found his in a box with his father's tools, the ones Robert had used to fix everything in the house, the ones he had once promised to pass down to his son but never got the chance. The house filled with memories. They looked through old photo albums, marveling at the young versions of themselves, at their parents' youth, at a time when they had less but somehow seemed happier. They found report cards their mother had saved, every single one, stored in a box in her closet. They found their childhood artwork, carefully preserved. They found evidence of a love so deep and abiding that it had quietly documented their entire lives. On January 10th, in the early hours of the morning, with all her children gathered around her bed and her grandchildren asleep in the living room, Margaret Hayes took her last breath. It was peaceful. She opened her eyes one final time, looked at each of her children, smiled, and whispered, "Remember." And then she was gone. The funeral was small, held at the modest church Margaret had attended faithfully for 50 years. There were no elaborate flowers or expensive caskets. Margaret had left specific instructions, written months before. She wanted simplicity. She wanted whatever money they might have spent on a grand funeral to go instead to the local food bank, the place that had once fed her family when they had nothing. But the church was packed. Hundreds of people came, people Margaret had touched in ways her children never knew about. Former co-workers from the diner who remembered her kindness. Neighbors she had helped without fanfare. People from the community who had known her as someone who gave even when she had nothing to give. They told stories the children had never heard. About how Margaret had paid for a stranger's groceries when their card was declined. About how she had babysat for single mothers in the neighborhood, refusing payment. About how she had volunteered at the homeless shelter every Thursday for 20 years, serving meals and offering dignity to people society had forgotten. Patricia stood at the pulpit to deliver the eulogy, and she spoke not of her own accomplishments or her mother's struggles, but of her mother's wisdom. She read from the notebook, sharing her mother's words with everyone gathered, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. "My mother gave us everything," Patricia said, her voice strong despite her grief. But her greatest gift wasn't the sacrifices she made, as profound as they were. Her greatest gift was teaching us, finally, what really matters. She taught us that love isn't something you say, it's something you do. It's showing up. It's sacrificing. It's putting others before yourself even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She looked out at her siblings, at her own children. We forgot that lesson for a while. We got lost in the pursuit of things that don't matter. But Mom brought us back. With her last months, her last gift, she brought us back to what's real. After the funeral, the family gathered at Margaret's house one final time before it would be sold. They sat in the small living room, crowded together on the worn furniture, and they made decisions about their future. Patricia announced she was stepping down as senior partner at her firm, moving to a position that would give her more time with her family. Daniel started a foundation in his parents' names, dedicated to helping struggling families with children. Jennifer decided to teach, to use her business expertise to help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds learn the skills they needed to succeed. Amy began volunteering at a free clinic one day a week, treating patients who couldn't afford care. The grandchildren made their own commitments. Tyler changed his major from finance to social work. Olivia sold half her wardrobe and donated the money to charity. The others found their own ways to honor their grandmother's legacy, to remember what she had taught them. They decided to keep the notebooks, passing them down through the generations. Every Christmas, they would gather and read from them, making sure that Margaret's words, her truth, her love, would never be forgotten again. But the real change was subtler and more profound. It was in the way they treated each other, the time they made for family, the priorities they shifted. It was in their understanding that success without love is hollow, that wealth without generosity is poverty, that busyness without presence is just noise. Margaret's simple gift, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, had been worth more than all the expensive presents under Patricia's tree that Christmas. It had been worth more than their mansions and their cars and their designer clothes. It had been the gift of truth, of memory, of love that demanded to be recognized and honored and continued. Years later, when Patricia's own children had children, she would wrap their Christmas gifts in brown paper tied with twine. She would include a letter, handwritten, telling them about their great-grandmother Margaret, about the sacrifices she made, about the love she showed, about the lessons she taught. And when they asked why she wrapped gifts that way, she would tell them the story. About the Christmas when everything changed. About the grandmother who gave them nothing and everything. About the moment they realized that the greatest gifts can't be bought, can't be wrapped in designer paper, can't be purchased at any price. They would tell them about love that sacrifices, about presence that matters more than presents, about the truth that sets you free even when it breaks your heart first. And every year, on the anniversary of Margaret's death, the family would gather at her grave, bringing fresh flowers and their own handwritten letters, telling her about their lives, their choices, their continued commitment to remember what really matters. Because that was Margaret's true gift. Not the notebooks themselves, though they were treasured. Not even the stories they contained, though they were retold countless times. Her true gift was the transformation of her family's understanding, the recalibration of their values, the restoration of their souls. She had given them nothing, and in giving them nothing, she had given them everything. She had shown them that love is the only currency that matters, that sacrifice is the language of devotion, that presence is the only present that truly lasts. And in the end, that plain brown package tied with twine, that simple gift that had been mocked and dismissed, became the most valuable inheritance any of them would ever receive. More valuable than houses or stocks or jewelry. More valuable than educations or opportunities or connections. It was the inheritance of truth, of memory, of love that demands we be better, do better, live better. It was the inheritance of a life well lived not for itself, but for others. It was the inheritance of a mother's love, given freely across decades, asking for nothing, hoping only that it would be remembered and passed on. And it was. God help them, it was. Margaret Hayes died with nothing in the bank and everything in her heart. And she left her children rich beyond measure, not despite her poverty, but because of it. Not despite her struggles, but because of them. She left them the only wealth that matters, the only treasure that endures, the only legacy worth leaving. She left them love. And in the end, it was enough. It was more than enough.